Good morning. We're in day 45 of our study, Mark's Gospel, chapter 13, 1 through 20, and this is a rather complicated passage that we'll try to get through carefully. Uh, Years ago, I used to pastor, my first ministry, preaching ministry, was in Grangeville, Idaho. And a friend of mine, Steve Crane, who is from Boise, was telling me that before I had gotten there, he had gotten a call if he could just come up and fill the pulpit for a weekend. Now, he'd never been to Grangeville. It's a small town in northern Idaho. He drove up there. He was told that the service would start, I think, at 10 o'clock or so. So he got there about 15 minutes early. He's wearing a suit and tie because that's what we preached in back then. And he's standing out in the foyer and he's greeting people. He's saying, "Hello, how are you doing? My name's Steve." And people seemed uh, friendly, just a little confused as to who he was. And he kept waiting for somebody to come up to him and say, "Okay, Steve, I'll introduce you. Here's what you need to know." And nobody did. So finally, he asked somebody, um, "Can you tell me when I'm supposed to preach?" And this person said, "You want to preach?" I said, "Well, yeah, I'm drove up here to preach today." I said, "Well, does the pastor know that?" He said, "I didn't think you had a pastor." He said, "That's him standing right over there." And he said, "Is this the Grangeville Christian Church?" And they said, "No, this is the Methodist Church. The Christian church is 2 blocks down the road." he, he made that 2 blocks in record time, got in there just as the service was starting, and a couple elders said, "Steve, where have you been?" Okay, here's the point. Sometimes we're in the wrong spot and we don't realize it. That story reminds me of this passage. Today's passage, I'll be honest with you, isn't that hard to understand. The problem is, a lot of times we're in the wrong spot with it and we don't even realize it. It's the passage that talks about wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and all kinds of horrible, nasty things, and we get very scared and worked up. But we have to ask ourselves, are we in the right place? That's what we'll be taking a look at today. So let's jump right in here and let's just start. I'm going to skip around, but we're going to start in verse 5. Jesus said to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, claiming I am he, and will deceive many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginnings of birth pains." Yeah, we're going to have an uplifting lesson today. This sounds awful, doesn't it? Well, if it's any comfort to you, it gets worse. Look down at verse 14. I'm going to read 14 through 20. It's kind of lengthy, so bear with me. "When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong," let the reader understand, "then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down or enter the house to take anything out. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter, because those will be days of distress unequal from the beginning, when God created the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, whom he has chosen, he has shortened them." Jeepers, what comforting words with everything we're going through nowadays, huh? We read this passage, we get kind of worked up. The abomination of desolation, what does that even mean? That sounds horrifying. I can remember when I was 7 years old, Dad was watching the news, and I was watching it with him, just sort of half paying attention. And I remember uh, the guy announcing the news said that there were a band of guerrillas that was attacking villages. And I thought, guerrillas are attacking, but that doesn't sound good. I sure hope those guerrillas don't get up here. Now, obviously, I didn't fully understand what the word gorillas meant. I had this vision of Planet of the Apes and chimps on horseback, what have you. Well, no. My fears were not valid. Well, here's the thing. If you were in one of those villages that these guerrillas were attacking, that's terrifying. But I didn't understand the fear for what it actually was. Now, Jesus is describing something that is terrifying here. Our question is the stuff that we need to be terrified about? Are our fears over this passage valid? No. And I'll tell you why. Because when we read this passage, we think, oh, Jesus is describing the end times right here. He's not. He's not doing that at all. How do we know he's not? Well, we have to look at the context. Look at verses 1 through 4, back at the very beginning of the chapter now. And I want you to see where the disciples are, and I want you to see exactly what Jesus is asked. As Jesus was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." Now, let me just stop right there and tell you. At this point, the temple was in the middle of a renovation. It was a 70-year renovation. And so there was scaffolding up. And if it's a 70-year renovation, and they're, at this point, I think they're in year like 40 or 50 or so, that means that for these disciples, they had never seen they'd never seen the temple when there wasn't renovation going on, when there wasn't scaffolding. So what they're commenting on is the progress. Look, Jesus, look at the progress that's being made. Isn't this exciting? Someday this temple is going to be done. Won't that be great? Right. With that in mind, someday this temple will be done. Won't that be great? With that in mind, look at what Jesus says, verse 2. Do you see all these great buildings? Replied Jesus. Not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us when these things will happen. What will be the sign that they are about to be fulfilled?" You see, Jesus announces, yeah, this building, this temple that you're so impressed with, it's all coming down. It's all going to get destroyed. And then, like a good teacher, now he's got their attention, now he's got their curiosity, he walks away. So later on the Mount of Olives, they're no longer in the temple. They've had time to think about this. Now they come to Jesus. Do you want to tell us what you were talking about? Now look very specifically what they're asking him. When will these things happen? In other gospels, they specifically ask, when will these things happen? Is it a sign of your return? And is it a sign of the end times? They ask three questions. Here in Mark's gospel, he has them only asking one. When will these things happen? What are these things? The temple being destroyed. Now, let me ask you this for those biblical scholars out there. Was the temple ever destroyed? Yeah, in 70 AD. 40 years after Jesus said this, 40-ish, 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple. They wiped out Israel. They wiped out Jerusalem. Israel did not exist again until 1948. It already happened. And what's interesting, the abomination of desolation, according to Luke's gospel, that refers to foreign armies surrounding the temple, just like it happened in 70 AD. So here's the thing. This passage is not about the end times at all. Later on, Jesus does talk about the end times, but this part here, abomination of desolation, even earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars, he specifically says that's not the end. Those are birth pains. That's not the end. Specifically, he's saying those aren't the end times. So here's the point. You don't need to get scared of this passage. But if all these things already happen, then is there anything this can teach us? Absolutely. So let's review what we know for sure about this passage and what we can get out of it. First, we do know that Jesus had a job for all of his disciples, these 12 guys specifically, but everyone who was a follower of Jesus, he had a job. He was going to leave. He wanted to carry on the work. And what was that work? To tell the world about Jesus. Secondly, we know Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. Now, here's the tricky part. Third, when Jerusalem is destroyed, and it wasn't destroyed in a day, this was a siege that took some time. So for a long time, tensions were mounting. People were scared. Would Israel survive? The answer was no. Well, this must be the end times then. You see, that's what people would start assuming. Jesus's followers would start thinking, well, the world is coming to an end. Was it? No. All right, if the world wasn't coming to an end, were you expected to carry on your work? Yeah. You see, here's the thing. You have to keep going no matter how bad things get. Can you keep going no matter how bad things get? Look at verses 9 through 11 here. You must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues on account of me. You will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all nations. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what to say. Just say what's given to you at the time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. You see, Jesus is talking to his followers who are going to make the assumption that in 70 AD, hey, it's the end of the world. It's not. It's just a really bad time. You have to keep going. You have to keep going. Stay on your guard. You'll be arrested. It'll be awful. Keep going. I'm with you. Now, let me ask you, is that good advice for today? We are going through a very difficult time. Keep going. We're going to get through this, but keep going. Spend less time watching the news, spend less time on Facebook, spend more time in prayer. Keep going. Do not give up. I want to close by telling you about a time that I had taken some kids on one of these week-long backpacking expeditions. We had hired a company. They take you out into the wilderness for a week. They try to kill you, that type of thing. And one of the things we had to do was rock climbing. Now, it turns out I loved rock climbing. Let me get more specific. Even though I have a terrible fear of heights, I loved rappelling. I didn't mind having a rope and going down the cliff because then I felt like Batman a little bit. Going up, that was work. But I would rappel down and then climb back up because I could rappel down again. That was the fun part. Now they had like 3 different runs that you could climb up. And I had done all of them except this one. I thought, well, I'll give this a try. And it wasn't that hard at all until I got about 10 feet from the top. And when I was 10 feet from the top, I was on this little ledge. And when I say ledge, it was about that wide. I mean, it was enough to get half my foot on. And I had kind of one little rock sticking out that I could grab onto with my hand. Now I was tied on with a rope, so even if I fell, I wasn't going to die. But the problem was they said when you're climbing up, you weren't allowed to climb up the rope. You had to use the mountain. The rope was just a precaution. I was 10 feet from the top, and I looked. There were no hand grips above me. There were no footholds. There was nothing. It was like glass. There was nothing there. And so I called up. There was one of the kids in my youth group. He was I think it was called, I don't know what he was doing. He was holding my rope basically. He was sitting on the ground. He had his feet braced. He had my rope. And his name is Duke. Hi Duke, if you're watching. But as I'm climbing up, I said to Duke, I said, okay, I can't go any farther. I'm just going to climb up the rope the rest of the way. And our guide heard that, and she ran over and said, no, that's not allowed. You have to climb up the side of the cliff. I said, but there's nothing to hold on to. She said, you have to climb up. All right, well, how about if I just maybe rappel down and come up another way? Nope, that's not allowed. You have to climb up the way you came. Okay, so she left. And now I'm trying to bribe Duke. I'm trying to say, hey, Duke, what's it going to take for you to let me just climb up the rope? She heard that, came running back over. That's not allowed. After about 15 minutes of struggling, I finally called her over and said, okay, I quit. I give up. I can't make it up. I've tried everything. I cannot make it up. I'm climbing down. She said, that's not allowed. I was telling this story once at a junior high camp, and I was really going into embellishing all the details. It took a long time to tell it, and I had one junior higher raised his hand and You're asking a question. He goes, yeah, did you ever get off? I did. To this day, I don't know how. I do not know how. I somehow I made it up that sheer cliff with nothing to hold on to. I made it up. I don't know how. I'm very proud of that actually. That's like physically the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And I'm kind of glad that I wasn't glad at the moment, but I'm glad that that guide was there telling me you cannot quit. You have to keep going. You cannot quit. This is what Jesus is telling his disciples. This is his message for us today. Keep going. Do not quit. No matter how bad things look, no matter how awful it is, how much you may want to give up, you keep going. Have a great day. Stay positive. We'll see you on Monday.